Welcome to this recording of the PFAS MCL Rule Public Water Supplier and Operator Training. This recording will cover Lesson 2, and we will discuss the monitoring and reporting requirements in the PFAS MCL Rule. In this lesson, we will focus mainly on the monitoring requirements for the PFAS MCL Rule, which includes initial compliance monitoring, repeat compliance monitoring, performance monitoring, and monitoring waivers. We will also cover the analytical requirements associated with the rule, reporting requirements and reporting instructions, and we will explain Ucmr 5 monitoring and the overlap it shares with the PFAS MCL rule. Before we get into the monitoring requirements, I want to first identify a few terms and acronyms that will be used throughout the lesson. First, you are probably familiar with maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. The full regulatory definition is in the workbook, which is available for download on the PFAS MCL Rule website, but essentially it is the maximum permissible level of a contaminant in water at a public water system. To review from Lesson 1, the MCL for PFOA has been set at 14 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion, and the MCL for PFAS has been set at 18 nanograms per liter. Remember, nanograms per liter and parts per trillion are equivalent and often used interchangeably. Another acronym we'll use is MRL, or minimum reporting level. PFAS contaminants can be detected at very low concentrations in the parts per trillion range. Therefore, the MRL is critical. Again, the full definition of MRL is in the workbook, but MRL is basically the minimum quantitation limit that can be consistently and accurately achieved, meaning it is the lowest level that labs are able to accurately and precisely quantify. The regulatory MRL is 5 parts per trillion, or nanograms per liter, for PFOA and PFAS. This is defined in the reg language. MRL is similar to, but distinct from, a detection limit. Labs may be able to detect to lower levels, but the measured concentrations are not as accurate at such low levels. For example, a lab may use a detection limit of 3 parts per trillion. So they may be able to detect PFOA at 4 parts per trillion. But if PFOA is detected by the lab at 4 parts per trillion, it is considered non-detect for compliance purposes under this rule because it is below the regulatory MRL. RNC less than the MCL is another key term to review, and this refers to samples being reliably and consistently below the MCL. This term is defined in the regulations. By definition, reliably and consistently means that each sample result is less than 80% of the MCL. So these levels would be 11.2 nanograms per liter and 14.4 nanograms per liter for PFOA and PFAS. And this will be important in determining repeat monitoring frequencies. So we'll see this term again. Now let's begin our monitoring discussion with initial compliance monitoring requirements. Community and non-transient non-community water systems are required to conduct initial monitoring. It will also be required for BVRB systems, which we'll discuss separately later in this lesson. Since PFAS are a type of synthetic organic chemical, or SOC, the monitoring and reporting requirements for PFAS were built from the existing SOC requirements. Compliance monitoring is required at each entry point. Initial monitoring will consist of samples in 4 consecutive quarters. Systems serving a population of more than 350 will begin monitoring in the first quarter of 2024. And systems serving a population of 350 or fewer will begin monitoring in the first quarter of 2025. Initial monitoring is required if a new source is added to a new or existing entry point beginning the first full quarter the source is in operation. Systems can submit a request to the department to edit their initial monitoring start date from the default dates listed here to align with their monitoring schedule for the 5th Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or Ucmr 5, which could result in a different year, but we'll talk more about that later in the lesson. So now that you know that initial monitoring consists of 4 consecutive quarters, what happens next? The repeat monitoring frequency is determined based on the initial monitoring results. Requirements for repeat monitoring are determined independently for PFOA and PFAS. In other words, a water system could be on different schedules for each. There are 3 possible paths for repeat compliance monitoring. The lower green path is used if the concentrations for all 4 quarters of initial monitoring are below the minimum reporting level or not detected. The middle yellow path is used if any of the concentrations are greater than or equal to the MRL, but in all 4 quarters they are less than or equal to the corresponding MCL. And the upper red path is used if any one of the 4 quarters has a concentration greater than the corresponding MCL. Let's look at each path in more detail. If PFAS is never detected above the MRL during initial monitoring, then the required monitoring for that PFAS reduces to 1 sample in each subsequent 3-year compliance period, or triennial monitoring. Here's an example. River Birchboro had all non-detects during initial monitoring for PFOA at entry point 101. Since all results were non-detects, River Birch will monitor for PFOA every 3 years at entry point 101. When do they sample within that 3 years? It has to match the year used for reduced monitoring that's already granted for other SOCs or VOCs. System monitoring calendars in the Drinking Water Reporting System, or DWRS, will show this. Now let's consider what the repeat monitoring frequency will be if there are detected PFAS contaminants during initial monitoring. If any PFOA or PFAS concentration during initial monitoring is greater than or equal to the MRL, but all concentrations are less than or equal to the corresponding MCL, then quarterly monitoring continues. Once results are in for 4 consecutive quarters, including the initial detection, with concentrations that are less than 80% of the corresponding MCL, or again, that reliably and consistently below the MCL number, then the department may allow the repeat monitoring to be done annually. Again, this is determined based on each individual result less than 80%, not a running annual average calculation. The annual monitoring due to a previous detection should be done in the calendar quarter that previously had the largest concentration. So let's look at an example. Here is River Birchboro again, but now we have their PFAS data at entry point 101. You can see that there were 2 detections in quarters 3 and 4. So since they had detections, they need to continue monitoring quarterly, at least until they have a total of 4 consecutive quarters following the detection that show results are reliably and consistently below the MCL. So since the detection first occurred in the 3rd quarter, they have 2 quarterly results that are reliably and consistently less than the MCL in quarters 3 and 4 of 2024, and they need at least 2 additional quarters. So here are their results for the next 2 quarters. And now, since they have 4 consecutive quarters that are all individually, reliably, and consistently less than the MCL after they initially had a detection, they can now reduce to annual monitoring. And remember, annual monitoring due to a previous detection should be done in the calendar quarter that previously had the largest ever concentration. So in this case, that would be in the 4th calendar quarter. Now let's look at what happens if there is a detection over the MCL during initial monitoring. If any quarterly PFAS result is greater than the corresponding MCL during initial monitoring, quarterly monitoring continues, just like it did with detections less than the MCL. After any MCL exceedance, repeat monitoring will be conducted quarterly, beginning the quarter after the exceedance. There is still a possible path to annual monitoring following an MCL exceedance, with 4 consecutive quarterly results reliably and consistently below the MCL, just like we saw previously. The difference here is that a compliance determination will also happen simultaneously. Compliance will be discussed in Lesson 4 of this course. Next, we're going to talk about increased monitoring. Once a system is on a reduced monitoring schedule, there are certain scenarios that will require them to increase their monitoring. So, for example, if a system is on triennial monitoring, which, if you remember, would be from no previous detections, then any detection will increase their monitoring frequency to quarterly. Here's an example. The system had all non-detects at entry point 101 during initial monitoring for both PFOA and PFAS, so they went to triennial monitoring for both. Then they had a detection of PFOA during their triennial monitoring, as shown here, with a detection of 6.1 parts per trillion for PFOA at entry point 101. Since there was a detection, PFOA at entry point 101 is now on quarterly monitoring, beginning with the quarter following the detection. PFAS, however, remains on a triennial monitoring frequency since there was still no detection of PFAS. Again, if the water system subsequently has results from 4 consecutive quarters that are all reliably and consistently below the MCL, then they may be able to reduce monitoring for PFOA at entry point 101 to annually. Another scenario that would require a system to increase their monitoring is shown here. During annual monitoring, an increase to quarterly is required after an annual result exceeds an MCL. Remember, a system would be on annual monitoring if they had a previous detection, followed by 4 consecutive quarters that are reliably and consistently below the MCL. So in the example shown here, this system was on annual monitoring for both PFOA and PFAS at entry point 101 and got a non-detect for PFOA, but 21 parts per trillion for PFAS, which is over the MCL of 18. So this system would need to go back to quarterly monitoring for PFAS. A confirmation sample is required if a water system is on annual or triennial monitoring and a result exceeds an MCL. So in our example from the last screen, PFAS exceeded the MCL while the system was on an annual monitoring frequency. So a confirmation sample must be collected, and it must be done within 2 weeks of notification from the accredited laboratory performing the analysis that an MCL has been exceeded. You'll see how this fits in with compliance determinations later. The routine sample and confirmation sample will be averaged for comparison to the MCL, but we'll cover that in Lesson 4. Next up is waivers, but before we talk too much detail about waivers and when they apply, let's quickly review a few points about monitoring frequencies. Remember that PFAS monitoring is automatically reduced to triennial if not detected during initial monitoring. No waiver is required for this reduction in monitoring frequency. If a PFAS is detected, monitoring is required quarterly for at least 4 consecutive quarters. And if results from 4 consecutive quarters are reliably and consistently below the MCL, monitoring is reduced to annually. And again, no waiver is required for this reduction. So this is where we pick up the discussion on monitoring waivers. After 3 years of non-detects during annual or quarterly monitoring following a previous detection, the water system may apply for a use waiver. If granted, the waiver reduces monitoring from annual to triennial. This is not a complete waiver from conducting any monitoring, but a waiver to monitor triennially instead of annually. And no susceptibility waivers will be granted by the department for PFAS. Some considerations for obtaining a use waiver for PFAS compliance sampling include only groundwater and groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, or GUDI systems, are eligible. So surface water systems are not eligible for a waiver. And a system is only eligible if there is no treatment for PFAS removal. PFOA and PFAS are determined independently, so a system could have a waiver for one and not the other. And a waiver is effective for one compliance period and may be renewed in each subsequent compliance period. For systems that have PFAS removal treatment, compliance monitoring for the specific PFAS for which treatment has been installed must be done at least annually. And whether it's annually or quarterly will depend on whether the target PFAS is reliably and consistently below the MCL. Performance monitoring for the specific PFAS for which treatment has been installed will be done at least quarterly, and all performance monitoring requirements will be specified in the operating permit special conditions. For consecutive systems, PFAS compliance monitoring exemptions will be granted to water systems that obtain their finished water from another permitted public water system if the following conditions are met. The purchased water is their only source. The water system supplying the finished water performs the required monitoring and is in compliance with the MCLs. And a copy of the analytical reports are received by the department. Bottled, vended, retail, and bulk, or BVRB, water systems also have to comply with PFAS monitoring and compliance. BVRBs are held to the same compliance monitoring requirements, and initial quarterly monitoring begins January 1, 2024. And systems which have installed treatment to comply with an MCL shall conduct quarterly operational monitoring for the contaminant for which the treatment is designed to remove. Next, we have an activity to test your understanding. You can find activity number 1 in the workbook, beginning on page 2-9. It's a scenario using the fictitious Peat Moss Borough public water system. You may pause the recording now to work through the activity and answer the questions, and then come back to the recording. The next several slides will go over the answers to the activity. Peat Moss Borough is a small community water system that serves 450 people and consists of 2 groundwater sources, Well 1 and Well 2, and 2 entry points, 101 and 102, that each supply water to their distribution system. We'll review the activity answers on the next few slides. Question number 1, is peat moss required to monitor for PFAS under the new rule? Why or why not? Yes, because all community water systems, regardless of size, must conduct PFAS monitoring. Question 2, if so, when is their initial compliance monitoring start date and why? Their initial compliance monitoring start date will be January 1, 2024, and this is due to the population they serve being greater than 350 people. Question 3, what will be their initial compliance monitoring frequency and number of samples required and why? They will conduct quarterly monitoring. All community water systems begin PFAS initial compliance monitoring on a quarterly frequency. They will be required to collect 8 samples in total. This is because they'll be doing quarterly monitoring and collecting samples each of 4 quarters. required at both of their entry points 101 and 102. So 4 quarterly samples per year times 2 entry points is 8 samples total. So now that we have their initial compliance monitoring figured out, let's take a look at their monitoring results. Here are the initial compliance monitoring results for peat moss at the end of 2024. For entry point 101, all samples came back non-detect for both PFOA and PFAS. For entry point 102, we have all non-detect samples for PFOA, and for PFAS, we have non-detects for quarters 1 through 3, and a detected result of 6.4 parts per trillion for quarter 4. So now let's use this initial monitoring data to see peat moss's next steps for repeat monitoring. Question 4, what will their repeat monitoring schedule be for entry point 101 and entry point 102, and why? For entry point 101, they will be on triennial monitoring for both PFOA and PFAS, and this is due to all results non-detected or less than the MRL for both PFOA and PFAS. For entry point 102, they will be on triennial monitoring for PFOA, but they will remain on quarterly monitoring for PFAS. The quarterly monitoring for PFAS is due to their 4th quarter monitoring result that's over the MRL and less than the MCL. So now let's look at repeat quarterly monitoring results for PFAS at entry point 102. Since the detection was in the 4th quarter of initial monitoring, shown here in gray shading, they need at least 3 more quarters of monitoring. The sample results yield a non-detect in the 1st quarter of 2025 and 5.1 parts per trillion and 4.2 parts per trillion in the 2nd and 3rd quarters, respectively. So question 5 is, with their repeat quarterly monitoring having been completed at entry point 102, what will their monitoring be for PFAS at entry point 102 after these 2025 sample results? And the answer is that entry point 102 will transition to annual monitoring for PFAS, and this is because all of their individual results in 2025 were less than 80% of the MCL, or again, that reliably and consistently less than the MCL. Annual monitoring should occur during the 4th calendar quarter because that was the quarter with the highest result. And as a side note, for those of you who caught it, the 3rd quarter 2025 result of 4.2 parts per trillion is less than the MRL of 5 parts per trillion. So really, this should be reported by the lab as a non-detect or 0. Good catch if you noticed that. Now that we have covered monitoring requirements, we'll review analytical requirements for the PFAS MCL rule next. Sampling and analysis must be performed in accordance with analytical techniques adopted by the EPA under the Federal Act or methods approved by the department. And any laboratory conducting analysis must be accredited by Pennsylvania DEP for PFAS analysis. Currently, there are 3 approved methods for PFAS and PFOA analysis, which are identified in the rule language. EPA Method 533, EPA Method 537.1, and EPA Method 537 version 1.1. The link on the screen, which is also in the workbook, will direct you to our database where you can enter your search criteria such as the analyte, analysis method, etc., and find Pennsylvania accredited laboratories for PFAS analysis. And you can also find this link and a link to a list of labs on our PFAS MCL Rule website. Next, let's look at reporting requirements. Sample results must be reported appropriately and on time. As with all compliance monitoring data, monitoring results for PFOA and PFAS must be reported via Dweller, the Drinking Water Electronic Laboratory Reporting System, by the 10th of the month using the appropriate contaminant and method codes, appropriate units, which again is parts per trillion, and sample type and location IDs. Reporting instructions are available for labs to report compliance data. The contaminant codes and method codes shown here are also in your workbook and in the lab reporting instructions. The next portion of this lesson will be dedicated to discussing the monitoring requirements of EPA's 5th Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR 5, and the overlap with the PFAS MCL Rule initial compliance monitoring. UCMR 5 is applicable to all community water systems and non-transient non-community water systems serving 3,300 or more, plus a random subset nationally of 800 smaller water systems. UCMR 5 requires monitoring for 29 PFAS and lithium using a method specified by the rule and an EPA-approved laboratory. And sample collection is at the entry point between the years 2023 and 2025. For systems serving over 10,000, the water system will select a UCMR 5 approved lab of their choice, and the water system will pay for their own sample shipment and analysis. For systems serving 10,000 or fewer, EPA will select a UCMR 5 laboratory, and EPA will send sample kits to the water system and pay for sample shipment and analysis. There is some overlap between the monitoring requirements of these rules for PFOA and PFAS for systems in Pennsylvania. This table compares and contrasts those overlapping requirements and the similarities and differences. The PFAS MCL rule sets MCLs for the contaminants PFOA and PFAS, which are also 2 of the 29 PFAS included in UCMR 5. As noted earlier, the initial compliance monitoring period under the PFAS MCL rule is in either 2024 or 2025, and monitoring under UCMR 5 is required during a consecutive 12-month period that occurs between 2023 and 2025, so there is some overlap there. The PFAS MCL rule includes 3 approved methods for analysis: EPA methods 533, 537, and 537.1. Under UCMR 5, analysis of PFOA and PFAS is required to be conducted following EPA method 533, which again is some overlap because that is one of the approved methods for Pennsylvania. The monitoring frequency under the PFAS MCL rule for initial monitoring is quarterly. Under UCMR 5, surface water systems are required to conduct quarterly monitoring, but groundwater systems only monitor twice in 12 months. And for location and number of samples, under the PFAS MCL rule, monitoring is required at each entry point, and the number of samples required is dependent on the Comprehensive Monitoring Plan, or CMP. If there are multiple sources that are operated in several different configurations, more than one sample per entry point may be necessary in order to ensure representative monitoring. Under UCMR 5, monitoring is also at the entry point, but only one sample is required. In order to create a potential cost-saving option for water systems, DEP can potentially accept dual-purpose data, that is, the same set of data which is used for both UCMR 5 and Pennsylvania's initial compliance monitoring, but only if all requirements are met. Those requirements that must be considered are: samples must be collected within the required time frame and with the required number of samples. Samples must be analyzed using an approved method. Samples must be analyzed by a laboratory accredited in Pennsylvania for analysis. And samples must be reported appropriately and on time. It's important to note that it is the responsibility of the water system to ensure that all of these requirements are met. It's also important to note that for systems serving less than 10,000, remember that EPA is selecting the Ucmr 5 lab and paying for sample shipment and analysis. So this may complicate the water system's ability to use the data for both purposes. Some labs are also reporting that quality control requirements for reporting the data under the two rules may be different, which may also be a complicating factor. Because of this, labs may or may not be able to accommodate a water system's request to report the same set of data for both rules. It's very important that a water system talk to their lab if they are considering dual-purpose sampling. For more information and details on the overlap in monitoring and meeting these requirements, there is a recording of a previous webinar on the PFAS MCL Rule website, which covers this topic in significant detail. The link to the webinar is under the training section heading of the PFAS MCL Rule webpage. So that concludes lesson 2 on monitoring and reporting requirements. I'm going to quickly review some key points from this lesson. Initial compliance monitoring consists of 4 consecutive quarterly samples at each entry point. Initial monitoring begins January 1, 2024 for community and non-transient non-community water systems serving more than 350 and all BVRBs, or January 1, 2025 for community and non-transient non-community water systems serving less than or equal to 350. Repeat monitoring is dependent on initial monitoring results, and performance monitoring when treatment is installed is according to operating permit special conditions. Samples must be analyzed by an accredited lab using an approved method and must be reported appropriately and on time. And there is some overlap between the initial monitoring requirements of this rule and Ucmr 5 monitoring. The next lesson in this course is Lesson 3, Sample Collection Considerations.